Hello everyone, you can call me Freebiewitz, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Analyze and Adapt, where I see if a video game would work in 3 different mediums. Tabletop, as in board and card games, tabletop roleplay, like Dungeons and Dragons, and finally, as a Larp. Today, we're taking a look at one of my most favorite games, Endless Legend. For those of you who don't know, Endless Legends is a 4X game. The 4 X's stand for Explore, Expand, Exploit, and Exterminate. Now I know all the words use X's in the names, and I'm sure it's better for marketing that way, but I've always wondered why it doesn't just say it's a 4E game, since that's what all the words start with. Anyways, ignoring that, the basic premise is that you're in the world of Auriga, trying to grow your civilization next to some other folks. You can go to war with them, build alliances, or anything in between. What makes Endless Legend stand out in my opinion compared to other 4X games is its lore, its aesthetics, and of course, the drastically different gameplay focuses of each faction. You can play as the shiny broken lords who eat the game's equivalent of money. You can play as the roving traders who literally can't declare war and live in cities that walk around. Or you can even play as the insectoid swarmy necrophage whose most peaceful interaction with everyone else is Cold War, so not that peaceful. I fell in love with the setting, its races, and its mechanics, but I'm not here to tell you about how great the game is. I'm here to analyze and adapt it. So let's start with Tabletop. Right off the bat, like so many other turn-based games we've analyzed and adapted, we could in theory make a one-to-one adaptation of the game into a board game right now. Everything is divided into hexes, allowing players to move around on the board, and I don't know if it was intentional or not, but the video game itself looks like a shiny digital board game. Now, ignoring things like Fog of War, almost everything can directly be translated into a real-life board game with little to no tweaking. However, like I've explained before in previous videos, this would be a bad idea due to how many moving parts there are. Off of the top of my head are neutral units that roam the map, fighting anyone within their predefined territories. The question becomes then is who controls them and when? Making it more confusingly difficult is the ability to hire them as mercenaries and have them still appear as neutral units regardless of their actual alliances. In the video game, most folks could guess that someone is behind these so-called neutral attacks, especially if the mercenaries aren't local to the area or are stronger than normal. If we do this in real life, however, with physical moving pieces, the person pulling the strings would actually have to pull the metaphorical strings right in front of the person they'd want to trick. That said, I could be convinced to keep this mechanic in a board game, even if it's blatantly obvious who's paying the neutral mercenaries off due to the diplomacy system. Now, quick disclaimer, I don't remember the exact mechanics on how it works, but I do remember certain diplomatic actions can become more expensive or cheaper based on your and other players' actions. In that regard, attacking a unit in neutral territory might make it easier to declare war on each other, but if your patrol gets wiped out by the local barbarian tribes, no one would be the wiser from a diplomatic viewpoint. Now we could have an overseeing game master controlling all the NPCs to mitigate this, but then you'd have the roving trader passing them secret messages, which in of itself is very suspicious, even if they're completely innocent. Then you have invisible characters, something difficult to handle in a game where everyone can physically see the pieces. We could say that the unit is untargetable, but what's stopping a player from surrounding the invisible unit with their own? We could have the invisible units pass through them as well, but once again, they could still be followed as if they weren't invisible, waiting and babysitting their enemies until they reappear. This would be less of an issue in a role-playing game, but we're not talking about that medium right now. So let's move on to the board itself. I'm going to start by being fairly lazy and just say we can do what HeroScape does in that we have hex tile pieces and connect them as appropriate to create the board. If I've edited the video correctly, you should now be seeing a game of HeroScape with the hex tiles. Well, that would let us keep to the spirit of Endless Legend and give us a multitude of different maps. The issue here becomes scale. Some Endless Legend maps can be quite large, larger than most tables. Now, if the table becomes large enough to facilitate these maps, then you have the issue of our arms being too short, as in the middle parts of the huge map are now physically unreachable. Assuming we all have unnaturally long arms, I can still see people losing track of their units and completely forgetting about them. In the video game, if you have a unit with actions available, it'll come up with a prompt, but in real life we don't have such mechanics to guide us. Then we have combat, which stat-wise can probably be done well enough with some tweaking for the sake of making the game easier to track. However, in the video game, when you get into combat, you close off sections of the map and use that as the combat zone itself. Units and figures that have nothing to do with the conflict will have to be cleared before being placed back on the board when the battle is done, adding another level of busy work. That's pretty much what Endless Legend would become on tabletop. Busy work. Another issue I see is how turns work. In most other turn-based games, everyone waits for other people to make their moves before doing their own. Anyone who's ever played a game like that will tell you that it gets boring waiting for other players to do their own thing, assuming that you have that many players. Endless Legend doesn't do that, and instead lets players move all their stuff at the same time. If everyone's stuff is spread out, this wouldn't be too much of an issue, but what happens when someone is trying to chase down another player's units? Who would get priority to move first? Would it be the person who's running away, or would it be the person who's chasing them? It would end with both players snatching up their models and moving them as quickly as possible, increasing the potential to knock something over and even break it. And that's assuming everyone's playing with the best of intentions. In conclusion, it'd be impractical, it'd be cumbersome, and overly filled with busy work, but Endless Legend would probably work as a board game if adapted this way if you squinted enough. So let's see if we can make things a little more simple in a different medium. Now, before we discuss how to turn this into a tabletop RPG, I just want to say that this game was one of the games that inspired these Analyse and Adapt videos in the first place. While I still do love Endless Legend, there was a time when I loved it even more, to the point where I decided to make a D&D 5th edition campaign based around it. The basic premise of the campaign was that all the players were mercenaries, working for a roving trader as security as they traveled across Oregon for fun and profit. The rules and notes I used for this campaign will be provided in the comments below. It was fun, and I'd like to think my players enjoyed themselves too, but I'm not here to talk about my already existing D&D adaptation of the game. I'm here to analyze and adapt it anew. Oregon is a big world, and any campaign you come up with can be done anywhere on it. You could be a group of vaulters exploring the long-forgotten tunnels as you're hunted by a powerful necrophage hero. You could be a Draken delegate of emissaries trying to make peace in various courts of other races. Or you could be a party of rebel broken lords trying to stop your race from becoming vampiric monsters. The world can be as simple or as complicated as you want it to be, as large or small scale as well. You can have multiple civilizations be the focus of the game, or just a single one, just like the video game allows you to do. Dust in this setting is an interesting resource in that it's both currency and literal power. In my D&D adaptation, I use it as a spell component for all spells and magics, and I don't see much reason not to do the same thing here, albeit I'd make it slightly more freeform in how it'd work. The specific economy of dust would be hard to figure out, but I think it can be done even if we have to make it abstract. Beyond that, I now want to talk about character creation. The racial options are straightforward enough, but the classes are a bit odder, especially if we play the adaptation in a one-to-one way. We could just take the 5 hero types and use them as classes, such as infantry, range, support, flying, and cavalry, and the main modifiers to these classes would be the races themselves. That said, I always wish there was more than one hero type variety among the races. Every single hero for the Wild Walkers, for example, are considered range units no matter what you do. What's a guy got to do to have an infantry Wild Walker hero or a support one? Sure, you can have heroes from the same race fill different roles in the game, from long-range damage dealers to diplomatic governors or stealthy spies, but those mechanics, at least from level 1, are baked into each unique character rather than their race or hero type. Speaking of diplomatic governors, how the hell do we translate plus 25% industry boost for a hero character in a role-playing game? We're all used to adding numbers to damage, so that's not weird at all, but having a character give industry boost to a city? Now, the ability to drum up influence could be your character's charisma, I suppose, so that means industry is their knowledge of building, while agriculture could be, well, agriculture? Or planning? Unless Endless Legend is a game about statecraft, these stats would likely never be used. Seriously, a role-playing game based around running a country? A role-playing game based around running a country. Huh. Now that I've said it out loud, it doesn't actually seem like such a bad idea. While there would certainly be combat-heavy games within the world of Endless Legend, a more political style campaign might work as well. I mean, I've already discussed Draken Emissaries, why not this? Now, in the video game, only one governor can be added to a single city. If we wanted multiple governors, they'd have to be spread out across multiple locations, thus splitting the party. However, if we're adapting it into a one-to-one way, I can see how this can be circumvented. I speak, of course, of Volters. In the video game, the Volter race has the ability to teleport their units from one city to another. That'll be one way of having the party still be a party, even if they spend most of their in-game time doing paperwork. We could just say that they're counselors as well, representatives from minor races that have been assimilated. It would likely be a lower combat style game, which many players certainly enjoy, but I'm unsure how much of that would keep to the spirit of Endless Legend. We could also have the party be members of different races doing diplomacy with each other, but that idea leaks into Larp a bit too much, as I'll explain in the next section. If we try to keep the diplomatic nature and statecraft parts of the game alive, then I can only see one option for Larp, and that option is to turn Endless Legend into a MUN, a Model UN. For those of you who don't know what a MUN is, to put it simply, it's a simulation of the United Nations Conference with various countries meeting up to discuss politics. It's supposed to be an educational thing, but it's been co-opted for alternate history scenarios and many sci-fi or fantasy settings as well. Quick disclaimer, I've never actually attended any MUNs myself, and for the most part, my knowledge comes from research on the internet or second-hand sources who are much smarter than I. The closest thing to a non-combat LARP I've ever participated in was a murder mystery type game set in a fantasy world. Anyways, a quick Google search tells me that they've done MUNs for Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and Doctor Who, just to name a few. To that end, Endless Legend shouldn't be too difficult as an established universe with a variety of different factions and diplomatic situations to work through. Now, I know I've just said that it's an established universe, but the fact that each Endless Legend game has randomized maps means that each MUN's political situation can be different as well, and the only faction that wouldn't actively participate are the necrophages, who can't really do diplomacy. But if they did participate, it'd be restricted to them declaring war and dropping all out war down to the status of Cold War, which could also be fun if done right, I suppose. Anyways, with little experience in MUNs, I can't really analyze and adapt Endless Legend all that well, even if the idea intrigues me greatly. I'll probably talk to one of my friends who does participate in MUNs more and ask for their opinion on the subject, but for now, just assuming we're ignoring the politics, let's try to get into the more combat side of things. As far as leveling up goes in the video game, it mostly gives a buff to stats. Very few abilities actually lets the players do something new. In other LARPs, when you level up, sometimes you'll get the ability to hit harder, sometimes you'll get the ability to throw a fireball. Point is, you get to do something that you couldn't before. But in Endless Legend, most abilities such as the ability to drain life come from items or the units themselves. If we were to adapt this game to LARP, we'd have to simplify the numbers and find a way to denote damage without having to yell out said numbers all the time. Note that some LARP games don't mind and even encourage players to shout out numbers during combat, and that leads to smoother gameplay, but for the sake of argument and immersion, we'll try to avoid that here. So to that end, having weapons that deal more damage based on levels is going to be taken out. My reasoning behind that is, unless we shout out numbers when we hit each other, players won't know how much damage they receive when they're struck. You could have the damage be based on attack names, but then you'd have to have everyone memorize how much damage each attack does, and that would make it more difficult for new players to learn the system. If we make different weapons deal different damage, then it makes it harder to keep track of it if you're attacked from behind. Point is, it just becomes a mess. Now, I know I've only said bad things about these mechanics, but they do work in real-life LARPs. I'm unsure if they'd work for Endless Legend specifically. So what would make an Endless Legend LARP an Endless Legend LARP from a mechanical point of view? What would make it any different to a fantasy-based LARP? Mechanically? Not much. At the end of the day, it's still a bunch of people hitting each other. Broken Lords, however, could eat the game's currency to heal, while Draken players would start with extra health. Vaulters would gain some sort of bonus when using specific colored equipment, and Ardent Mages get stronger the more hurt they are. The specific mechanics otherwise aren't too important right now, but the talk of races brings up another interesting point if we adapt this game in a one-to-one way. Assuming everyone is playing a simple, non-hero soldier unit, the different types of weapons available for each race expands. This once again assumes we're adapting it in a one-to-one way. Falter heroes in the video game can only use ranged weapons, but they have non-hero units that can wield axes, for example. Necrophages can use claws, swords, and other melee weapons, while their more monstrous units spit parasites. Said monstrous units for each side probably won't make it into the game, and if they do, they'd have to be shrunken down to fit. After all, while Bob is 7 foot and quite tall, nobody's going to mistake him for a 30-foot tree monster. In the end, the main thing that would make an Endless Legend LARP unique are the races, the currency, and the aesthetics. As far as mechanics go, they're either too restrictive, cumbersome, or impractical to use. To me, if I had to adapt Endless Legend into a LARP while maintaining the spirit of the game, I'd leave it as a setting in a mun with specific actions and mechanics unique to each race. Roving traders would be able to spy on people who make market transactions, broken lords wouldn't need food-producing lands, etc. In all likelihood, I'd run it as a crisis council, with winter getting worse and more frequent. Also necrophages declaring war. You can't go wrong with necrophages declaring war. So that's my analysis of Endless Legend and how it can be adapted into 3 different mediums. How do you think it'd work? Have any of you tried adapting any elements of the game yourself, and if so, how did it go? Comment, like, and subscribe, and maybe, just maybe, we'll come back to the subject sometime in the future. My name is Freebiewitz, and thank you for watching.